We talk a lot about inequality today, but it's really not a new conversation, is it?
Not at all. Thinkers have been wrestling with it for centuries.
And what we want to do today is explore how some of the real giants of economic thought actually saw it. How did they analyze inequality in their own times?
Exactly. That's the core of this deep dive. We're drawing on some really fascinating material here, specifically from Branko Milotovic's book, Visions of Inequality.
Right, from the French Revolution to the end of the Cold War. So think of this as, well, a way to get inside the foundational thinking on income distribution from the late 1700s right up to the late 20th century.
Yeah, our goal is to unpack their main arguments, maybe some surprising angles they had, and the really different ways they looked at it, and how the world they lived in really shaped their views.
And maybe what lessons that holds for us now, looking at inequality today. We're here to guide you through this, highlighting the really key ideas, the stuff that makes you think.
Okay, so first off, Milotovic's approach in the book itself. He calls it an instrumental approach.
Which means it's less about whether inequality is good or bad, morally speaking.
Precisely. It's more focused on how these thinkers actually saw income being distributed, what they thought caused those patterns, and, crucially, how they expected things to change or stay the same.
But the source does point out when their own biases might have crept in.
Oh, definitely. It explicitly flags where ideology might be influencing the conclusions. Like, how Quesnay's ideas seem to justify the nobility's income, or how Ricardo's arguments really defended the capitalist position against landowners.
So understanding their analysis, but with a critical eye on their perspective.
Exactly. And a really central point the book makes is about needing three things for a complete picture of income distribution.
Three things.
Yeah. The narrative, so the story, the historical context, the theory, the logical framework, the why, and the empirics, the actual data, the observations that back it up or challenge it.
Miss any one of those, and you've got an incomplete picture.
You got it. Narrative, theory, empirics,
Yep.
all essential.
That makes a lot of sense. You need the story, the explanation, and the proof. And the source really hammers home how much each thinker was a product of their specific time and place.
Absolutely. Quesnay in France before the Revolution, Smith in Scotland during the Enlightenment, Ricardo and Marx in the thick of Britain's Industrial Revolution.
Pareto, turn of the century Europe, Kuznets in post-war America.
Right. Their environment basically dictated the questions they even thought to ask and what seemed like relevant answers.
Which means, inevitably, they miss things that seem obvious to us now. The source notes that things like racial inequality, gender inequality, even inequality between countries, they barely touched on those.
Yeah, those just weren't central concerns for most of them back then. And understanding their context, their blind spots, well, it helps us see our own potential limitations, doesn't it? How our time shapes what we focus on.
It's like holding up a mirror, yeah. Okay, let's look into those early mirrors then, starting with François Quesnay.
Quesnay and his group, the physiocrats, they actually call themselves les économistes, the economists, arguably the first real school of economic thought.
And their core belief was all about the land.
Pretty much. Agriculture was the only thing that produced a genuine surplus, real new wealth. Everything else just kind of reshuffled it.
And they saw society in these rigid layers based on that.
Three classes, yeah. The proprietaries, landowners, clergy, officials who lived off the land's surplus. The productive class, the farmers who actually created the surplus.
Yeah.
And then the sterile class.
Which was everyone else.
Basically, merchants, manufacturers, artisans, anyone not directly farming or owning farmland. And the source points out this matched pre-revolutionary French society's top layers pretty closely.
And they thought the surplus just naturally flowed upward.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
It belonged with the proprietaries. It wasn't really meant for higher wages or big profits for the sterile class. The system worked, in their view, when that natural flow wasn't disturbed.
Was their vision one of growth, though, or just stability?
That's a bit debated. They did talk about capitalist farmers reinvesting. But some readings, like Rubin's mentioned in the source, suggest Quesnay ultimately saw a kind of steady state, where capital just replaced itself. It fit their rather static view of society.
Getting through Quesnay's actual writing sounds challenging. The source uses words like murky, long, hard slog.
Yeah, apparently riddled with errors, repetitions, maybe even deliberate obscurity. Grimm's quote about truth never being said clearly seems apt. It sounds like a real puzzle to piece together.
Only for masochistic economists today, the source jokes.
Right. And they had this strong bias, too. Very anti-city, apparently had real contempt for townspeople.
Not exactly a recipe for broad prosperity.
Ugh.
Okay, quite a contrast then with our next thinker, Adam Smith.
A huge contrast. Smith, of course, everyone knows his views on limiting government meddling in the economy.
That famous line about kings and ministers being the biggest spendthrifts.
Exactly. Manage your own house first. But when it came to different classes, he was, well, surprisingly critical, especially of employers.
Really, we often think of him as pro-business.
Well, he stated pretty bluntly that the interests of merchants and master manufacturers were, quote, always in some respects different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. He thought they were always looking for ways to deceive or even oppress the public.
That's powerful stuff. And he contrasted them with other groups.
Yeah. Landlords, he thought, their interests did align with general societal improvement because improving the land benefited everyone. And workers, their interests aligned too. But, and this is key, they lacked the power and influence to push their own narrow self-interest onto society like the employers could.
That's a really important distinction. What about his views on wages and growth?
He had this really interesting insight for his time. High wages weren't necessarily about how wealthy a country was overall, but about how fast it was growing.
Because growth increased demand for labor.
Exactly. In a world where many places were near subsistence, growth was the escape route, pulling wages up. It was the rate of change that mattered for workers.
But the relative shares between wages and profits didn't change much based on growth.
He seemed to think those proportions were more structurally fixed, yeah, regardless of whether the economy was advancing or declining overall.
You know, the source throws out the surprising description of Smith, the Juan Perón of economics.
Huh. Yes, meaning he's been claimed by all sides, right? From free marketeers to, believe it or not, later left-wing thinkers like the Ricardian socialists who built on his ideas. Shows how foundational his work was, open to different interpretations.
It really does. And personally, he wasn't just the staid professor.
Apparently not. Accounts range from serene and cheerful to Samuel Johnson calling him a dull dog and disagreeable after some drinks. A complex guy, clearly.
Okay, moving into the 19th century now. Two absolute titans who put class and distribution right at the center. Ricardo first.
David Ricardo. Yeah, his whole analysis revolves around functional income distribution, how the economic pie gets split between rent for landlords, profit for capitalists, and wages for workers.
And personal income just followed from which class you were in.
Largely, yes. Workers got subsistence, landlords got rent. The big action for him, the key conflict driving things in early 19th century England, wasn't capital versus labor so much as
capitalists versus landlords.
Exactly. The fight over profits versus rents. And this came to a head with the Corn Laws.
Right, the grain tariffs. How did they fit into his inequality picture?
Well, Ricardo argued the Corn Laws kept food prices artificially high. That meant capitalists had to pay higher wages just for workers to survive, and high food prices meant higher rents for landlords who owned the farmland.
So the capitalists were squeezed from both sides.
Precisely. Profits got crushed between rising wages and rising rents. So Ricardo's big argument was, get rid of the Corn Laws. Cheaper food would mean lower nominal wages needed for subsistence, lower rents.
And higher profits for capitalists to reinvest.
Exactly. He called it the Ricardian windfall. Abolishing the Corn Laws would boost growth and reduce inequality because it would slash the highest incomes, the rents going to landlords. For Ricardo, a growing economy meant less inequality, specifically because the landlord class's share would shrink.
Growth and lower inequality, driven by shifting power from landowners to capitalists.
Interesting. And he had a view on worker living standards, too.
Yeah, quite a practical one. He thought it would actually be good if workers developed a taste for comforts, a desire for a higher standard of living.
Not just for its own sake, but why? As a check on population growth. If workers demanded more than bare subsistence, they might have fewer children, preventing population pressure from constantly driving wages back down. Higher wages is a tool for population control, in a way.
Fascinating. And like Smith, Ricardo's influence has lasted, hasn't it?
Oh, hugely. The source notes he's still incredibly relevant across different economic schools. That framework of dividing income by factor shares is still fundamental.
Okay, which sets the stage for Karl Marx writing a bit later, when inequality in England was, according to the data, probably even higher.
Yeah, mid-19th century. Social tables from the time suggest inequality was high and rising, and capitalists had definitely gained ground relative to landlords since Smith's or even Ricardo's day.
And Marx's view of inequality went much deeper than just income shares, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. For Marx, The root cause wasn't just how the pie was sliced, but who owned the means to bake the pie in the first place.
The conditions of production.
Exactly. The fundamental division was between those who owned capital and land, the means of production, but didn't necessarily work, and those who owned only their ability to work, their labor power.
And he argued that this ownership structure automatically determined how consumption goods were distributed.
Yes, the distribution of income and consumption just flowed naturally from that underlying ownership structure. Tinkering with taxes or wages wouldn't fix the fundamental imbalance, in his view. The state couldn't easily change who owned the factories and the fields.
Central to this is surplus value, right?
Right. Wages, he argued, are set by the value of labor power itself, basically, what it costs to keep a worker alive and able to work. But workers produce more value than that cost during their working day.
And the capitalist takes the difference.
That's the surplus value. And crucially, Marx argued and saw evidence for that even if workers' real wages rose, they could buy more stuff, their relative wage, their share of the total value created compared to capital's share, could still fall.
So capital's power and share could increase even if workers weren't getting absolutely poorer.
Yes. The gap, the power dynamic, could widen. For Marx, this class struggle over surplus value was the engine of history, and capitalism was just the current stage.
Though, interestingly, he never quite finished defining class.
No, the source reminds us that famous chapter in Capital is unfinished, but he did analyze groups like the self-employed, the petty bourgeoisie, or small landowning farmers.
Contradictory classes.
Yeah, because they were sort of both owners and workers, caught in the middle, leading them to swing back and forth politically. And looking at 19th century France, the source mentions social tables showing this inverted pyramid, fewer people higher up, but holding way more wealth.
What about his idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall? That sounds pretty central.
It is, but it's complex. Marx saw capitalists constantly investing in more machinery and technology relative to labor, what he called a rising organic composition of capital.
Which should lower the profit rate relative to the total investment.
Right. But at the same time, capitalists are always trying to increase the rate of surplus value, getting more out of their workers. These two forces push in opposite directions.
So the profit rate doesn't have to fall.
Not necessarily. It depends which effect is stronger. But Marx saw the tendency for it to fall as a long-run pressure point, a potential brake on capitalism, alongside crises caused by things like overproduction.
And the Industrial Reserve Army, how did that fit in?
That's the pool of unemployed workers. Marx saw it as essential for keeping wages in check. When the economy booms and demand for labor goes up, this reserve army is there, preventing wages from rising too much and eating into profits. It maintains capital's leverage.
Listening to all this, it sounds like Marx predicted an inevitable, ever-widening gap between rich and poor.
Well, this is where the source suggests a more nuanced reading. Yes, Marx identified forces that increase inequality crises, concentration of capital. But he also saw counterforces rising real wages were possible, and the falling rate of profit itself worked against endless capital accumulation.
So not just one bleak path.
The source argues that Marx's analysis actually allows for multiple scenarios, not just the simplest story of ever-deepening misery. It's more dynamic than often portrayed.
Like Quesnay, though, Marx's writing style wasn't exactly beach reading.
No, that critique from Benedetto Croce calling capital a strange composition theory, satire, history, Hegelian jargon all mixed together, badly arranged, seems pretty common. Definitely dense stuff.
A recurring theme indeed. Okay, let's pivot now to two later thinkers who came at inequality differently. Pareto first.
Vilfredo Pareto, famous for Pareto's law or the Pareto distribution.
His observation that income distribution, especially at the top, follows a kind of predictable mathematical pattern.
Exactly. He found this pattern, captured by his alpha coefficient, seemed to hold across different countries and time periods he looked at.
And the controversial part was his claim that this pattern was basically unchanging, immutable.
Yes, he argued that the alpha value tended to stay within a fairly narrow range, around 1.5 to 2, suggesting the underlying inequality structure was remarkably stable, regardless of social or political changes.
But the source gives this claim a modern reality check.
Oh, it's a brilliant point. That narrow range of 1.5 to 2. If you translate that into what it means for the income share of the top 10% today, it covers a massive spectrum.
How massive?
It ranges from countries with incredibly high inequality, like Namibia, alpha near 1.5, to countries with much more moderate inequality, like Turkey, alpha closer to 2. That supposedly small technical range actually spans the inequality levels of about 40 different countries today.
Wow. So immutable was maybe a strong word. It highlights that tension in his work, bold claims, but then maybe some hedging.
Definitely. And there's a paradox, too. He insisted income distribution was fixed, yet he clearly saw that other social things, marriage patterns, mortality rates, did change with development. And his own theory about the circulation of elites, new groups rising to power, implies significant social change.
It seems contradictory.
It does. He even mused that socialism might win, not on merit, but through the sheer dedication of his followers, while still questioning if even socialism could change that fundamental distribution pattern. Always those caveats.
Okay, fast forward again. Simon Kuznets, working in a very different world.
Yeah. Post-World War II America. A time of relative prosperity, strong unions, seemingly lower inequality compared to earlier periods. A stark contrast to Marx or Pareto's context.
And this is where the famous Kuznets curve comes from, the inverted U-shape.
That's the one. The idea, the stylized fact, that as a country develops, inequality first rises during the early stages of industrialization.
As people move from farms to cities, creating wider wage gaps.
Right. And then as the economy matures, inequality levels off and eventually falls.
And he had explanations for why it might fall later on.
He did. Things like the gap between farm and city incomes narrowing, the share of income from capital potentially declining, and the rise of government intervention, progressive taxes, social safety nets, that kind of thing.
But he himself was cautious about this hypothesis.
Very much so. The source reminds us of his famous quote that it was maybe 5% empirical information and 95% speculation, possibly even wishful thinking.
And based on very limited data initially.
Just fragments from 6 countries at first. But it was a powerful, testable idea that kept the conversation about development and distribution going, connecting back to those classical questions, even if the proposed mechanism was new.
Okay, so after Kuznets, the source talks about a period where the study of inequality kind of faded. The long eclipse.
Yeah, within mainstream economics, particularly neoclassical economics, there was a definite shift.
Away from focusing on concrete social classes, workers, capitalists, landlords.
Exactly. The focus shifted towards distribution among abstract factors of production, just labor and capital, treated almost symmetrically.
And the source argues this ignored the power dynamics.
That's the critique. By creating this formal equivalence between someone selling their labor and someone owning a factory, he kind of glossed over the inherent power imbalances, the social relations that were so central to Smith, Ricardo, Marx. Income from capital just became the neutral return to a thing, disconnected from the social structure allowing that return.
The source even calls some of this Cold War economics. What's meant by that?
It suggests that, partly due to the political climate, maybe even funding sources, there was a pressure to move away from class-based analysis, which sounded too much like Marx, towards more abstract, seemingly neutral models, an alien abstract world, as the source puts it.
And there's actual evidence of this decline in focus.
Pretty striking evidence. Economic inequality didn't even get its own standard classification code in the main economics literature database until the 1990s. And you have that quote from Nobel laureate Robert Lucas calling distribution questions seductive and poisonous for economic analysis.
So the research that was done was kind of fragmented?
It seems so. You had empirical studies, maybe looking at wage data, but often without a strong theoretical or political framework.
Yeah.
And then you had very abstract theories that didn't really connect to the messy reality of social groups and power. Neither quite captured the full picture.
Was there any way back in for inequality?
Well, Keynesian economics offered a sort of back door. The idea that different income groups have different propensities to consume. Rich people save more of an extra dollar, poor people spend more, that reintroduced a form of class or income differentiation and suggested inequality could have real macroeconomic consequences.
And the source really contrasts these abstract models with the ongoing reality on the ground.
Yeah, pointing out that even when income inequality seemed lower, wealth concentration often remained incredibly high, like the top 10% in the U.S. owning maybe 90% of financial assets. There's often a big disconnect between the models and the reality of entrenched class divisions and wealth power.
And just looking at wages misses a lot, too.
A huge amount. It ignores income from capital, from self-employment, the role of government taxes and transfers, how families pool resources, and especially those incomes right in the very top that often don't show up well in standard surveys.
So focusing only on wage gaps is incomplete.
The source argues it's a profound misunderstanding of why inequality matters, its connection to class, politics, social mobility, how advantage gets passed down generations. It's about much more than just wage dispersion.
Okay, so when did things start to change? When did inequality studies make a comeback?
The source really points to the 2007-2008 financial crisis as a key turning point.
How so?
Well, the crisis just threw into sharp relief how different groups had fared in the preceding decades. It seemed like the people at the very top had captured most of the gains from growth, were maybe even responsible for the trash, and yet were largely insulated from the consequences. That disparity became impossible to ignore.
And that created an opening for figures like Thomas Piketty.
Absolutely. Piketty's work, especially Capital in the 21st Century, landed right in that moment, bringing inequality back to the absolute center of public and academic debate in a way it hadn't been for decades.
And his big argument is that simple formula, RG.
Right. When the rate of return on capital R is consistently higher than the overall economic growth rate, G, wealth concentrates, because income from capital grows faster than income from labor or the economy as a whole. Inequality tends to rise structurally.
It's an interesting contrast with Marx's view of capitalism's problems.
Totally. Marx thought capitalism might fail because profits would fall. Piketty suggests it might become unsustainable because capitalists are too successful, accumulating too much, making the system politically unstable.
This resurgence must also be fueled by better data.
Oh, massively. A real data revolution since the Cold War. We have household surveys covering almost the entire globe now, much better ways to compare incomes across countries.
And we're looking back into history differently, too.
Yes, the digitization of historical records has allowed for a revival of using social tables, old records of who did what and earned what to reconstruct class structures and inequality patterns deep into the past, really integrating the social and political context.
And the study of global inequality has taken off, too.
Yeah, thinking about inequality not just within countries, but across the entire world population. This actually builds on work done during the Cold War, often by heterodox economists looking at north-south divides, the core periphery structure. They pioneered thinking about inequality on a global scale.
Wow. It really is quite a journey through these different ways of seeing inequality.
It really is. From Quesnay's farmers and landlords in pre-revolutionary France to Smith's careful distinctions about whose interests align with the public good.
To Ricardo zeroing in on that landlord-capitalist fight over the Corn Laws and Marx's deep dive into ownership and class struggle.
Then Pareto's controversial but influential patterns, Kuznets' hopeful but speculative curve, this whole period of the eclipse.
And now the resurgence, driven by new data, new theories like Piketty's and, well, by reality hitting home after the financial crisis.
Yeah. And looking back at these older visions, it's not just history. It really helps you appreciate the sheer variety of ways people have tried to understand inequality, the different forces they blamed or credited.
And how much our own views right now are probably shaped by our specific place and time.
Exactly. Hopefully this deep dive has given you some, valuable moments on this long, complicated history of thinking about who gets what and why.
You know, one final thought the source raises is about power. It notes that even with all our data today, if we don't grapple with power structures and social relations the way the classical thinkers fundamentally did, our understanding might still be incomplete.
That's a really crucial point. So maybe something for you to think about is this. In our incredibly data-rich world today, are we really getting to grips with the underlying power dynamics that shape inequality? Or are we sometimes just measuring the symptoms?
A challenging question to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the visions of inequality.